Thank you very much indeed. As you can tell from my accent, I'm actually not from around here. Without further ado, if I shift this forward, I'm a New Zealander. For those of you who know about New Zealand, we're seriously into sailing. This is quite a famous sailboat that actually comes out of a place called Russell in the Bay of Islands, which is in the north of New Zealand, where I come from. We like fishing. For those of you who are pretty smart, you'll actually notice that's not a New Zealand fish. That's actually a striped bass, which I caught off the Cape Cod here on the east coast of the United States. And I can see you smiling there, sir. And then, of course, we're known as Kiwis. And just to be very clear, a kiwi in New Zealand is an aggressive, prehistoric, flightless bird. It's not the fruit that we all eat a lot here in the United States. Okay, so that's what makes up New Zealanders. We travel the world, and the reason why, if you like, I'm qualified to speak to you today is that over the last 20 years, I've been directly accountable or indirectly accountable for over 1,000 phase 2 and phase 3 trials in most of the countries in the world, in all continents. And in fact, I'm very honored to say that I have been responsible for the trials for most of the sponsors that are in the New York Pharma Forum. And so I am very honored to be here today talking to you. You are my clients, basically. The last 3 years or so, I actually spent building a CRO in China called Pusey, PRA. And this is a view, for those of you that know Shanghai, this is a view from Xintiandi in Shanghai on a really good day. And this here is exactly the same view. You can see the buildings. This is exactly the same view on a normal day in Shanghai. And this is an important point. A picture basically tells us 1,000 words. This is a very important point about respiratory disease in China, which I will get into later on. About 20 minutes outside Shanghai, you can also be in a beautiful water village, and culturally, China is one of the most interesting countries on the planet. I also live in Cincinnati, where currently MedPace is based. This is the fountain in the center of Cincinnati. And I also live in Philadelphia, not very far from here. And in many ways, these cities, Shanghai, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, they form a pharma valley. There is a valley around the world of sponsor companies and clinical research organizations which are driving many of the medical and therapeutic innovations that we see today. I am a serial CEO. So I am the founding CEO of Theorem Clinical Research, which recently became Chilton. I'm also the founding president of Pusey PRA. I'm the founding board member of a clinical trial software company called Y-Prime, which is very active in the Philadelphia area, which does many of your IWRs and your IVRS, so in other words, the database, the technology that drives the initial clinical trial database. And also, I'm on the executive committee of MedPace. But enough of that. Now, what we're here to talk about today is what are the opportunities and challenges of running clinical trials in Asia. And if you first look at the global, my question really related earlier to the growth of phase 2 and phase 3 trials in Japan. And that's a very positive thing, I think, for drug development in Japan. Very, very positive. But if you look in the Asia region as a whole, that's not actually the overall story. And here's, just to not pick on Asia, I've actually taken the 1572s that were registered with the FDA in several countries around the world. So this is not exclusive, but it shows you the main groupings of positives and negatives. And you can see that there are some countries which have had very significant declines in their 1572s, which means that pivotal global phase 2 and phase 3 trials, you can infer that pivotal phase 2 and phase 3 trials are not growing in those countries. Here's the Japanese number. Overall, still today, 60% of all global phase 2, phase 3 trials are run in the United States. So 60% of the data for all the registrations which come from the US. 20% comes from Western Europe, and the rest comes from Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a little bit from countries like China and Argentina and Brazil. And what I would like to explore with a case study, because this is a slightly controversial subject, what I would like to explore with a case study is why that might be. And the reason why it's important is because obviously the populations outside of the United States and Japan and Western Europe are much larger than the populations in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. So we are essentially developing drugs for populations which do not exist in the clinical trial centers where we're developing the drugs. And that has some implications, especially for the latest developments in focused medicines, focused therapeutics, and the increased understanding that we have about genomic editing and the genotypes that exist in all of those populations. So this is apart from it being a commercially, subject of commercial interest, it's also a subject of actual intense, basic scientific interest. So we're going to look at China just very briefly, and I don't pretend, even though I've lived there and worked there and have been accountable for running these phase 2 and phase 3 trials there, I don't pretend to be a China expert, and I would not, I've tried 3 times. I'm dishonored to tell you that I cannot speak Mandarin, and I apologize profusely to anyone from China of that. So I do not pretend to be a China expert. I'm simply reflecting on running clinical trials in Chinese hospitals. But if we look at the healthcare priorities and what the China government strategy is, and then we look at actually conducting clinical trials in that healthcare system, and then we look at, well, how can we improve data quality? This doesn't just apply to China. It applies to all countries in the world. And this last point is about how technology can help us to globalize high-quality data generation, even more so than it has done already. The healthcare priorities in China, it's very simple. The biggest healthcare challenge in China is actually smoking. When you look at smoker presence around the world, almost a third of the world's smokers live in China. And rather surprisingly, 60% of male Chinese doctors smoke. If you were to look at the same thing in a country like the United States, it would be about 3% of American male doctors smoke. And when you consider the diseases that smoking causes, it's not unusual that it's not unusual that one would then conclude that this is one of the biggest healthcare challenges that China faces. For example, if you look at non-small cell lung cancer, which is the biggest oncology killer in China, it doesn't have the same profile as non-small cell lung cancer in the United States or in Western Europe. EGFR rates outside of Asia are around 17%, and EGFR rates in this huge problem in China are over 40% in some studies. Because the healthcare system is so challenged from a resource point of view, non-small cell lung cancer does present very late, and for obvious reasons, the latest EGFR-focused treatments are not readily available in China. If you look at another respiratory disease, in this case, this data is pediatric asthma. The interesting thing is that historically, the prevalence studies for pediatric asthma in China have previously suggested that the rate was much lower. You can see there's a 2% rate there, 2.1%. But the latest prevalence data, and there has been a government-initiated focus on respiratory disease in the last 5 years in China. The latest prevalence data is actually suggesting that the prevalence is very similar to the rates that we see in all the other countries in the world. And given that we do see similar rates in all the other countries in the world, this is pediatric onset asthma, you would expect in the end that that rate would start coming towards these rates, and it does seem to be so doing. So this is a consequence of increased data, quality data review, and improved quality of prevalence rate studies. But the implications of this are enormous, because in the United States at the moment there are about 5 million pediatric asthma patients. If these prevalence rates are correct, there's somewhere, the least number of pediatric asthma patients in China is 9 million, and the most is a staggering 27 million patients, children who have got asthma. And given the other respiratory challenges, which I showed you in the slides of air pollution, this is a very significant clinical problem and a very significant clinical burden for Chinese hospitals, and it's not going to get smaller. What has the government in China done about this? Well, strategically, in my opinion, and as I say, I'm not a China expert, but in my opinion, I think they've done a lot. I think they've focused very clearly on the major causes of death, meaning that they've actually started focusing resources in the right place. Interesting, the fourth largest cause of death in China is COPD, which is different to major westernized countries in the rest of the world. It's a much bigger cause of mortality in China than it is in other countries. And also interestingly, the fifth largest cause of death is trauma and poison. But I should very swiftly add, that's not murder. That's actually someone who's been trying to commit suicide. It's again something that you see very commonly in westernized communities. So there's nothing strange there. And I've just picked the COPD initiatives that China has undertaken, and as you can see, in terms of since 2007, so it's a 15-year strategy. It's exactly what we would see in any developed country. A focus on reducing smoking, a focus on reduction of air pollution. We're seeing the first buildings actually being built in Shanghai and Beijing now that have complete filtered air systems, and improving the working environment for individuals is something that is now beginning to happen. So technology is being focused on improving that. And I also think we should, those that think that the China pollution is not going to get worse. I've spent 20 years on and off in various Chinese cities. I also remember when I was that high, living in London. My family used to go backwards and forwards between New Zealand and London. And in the late 50s and early 60s in London, the smog was absolutely terrible. And it wasn't until British government put in place strong legal measures with large fines to stop coal fire, dirty coal being used, that actually the smog in London was fixed. And for those of you from America, you've seen the same thing in many American cities over the years as well. So I don't think we should think that the efforts to prevent air pollution in China are not going to work. History suggests that they will, which is a good thing. The early intervention and the early correct diagnosis of respiratory disease in China is also something which is changing dramatically, and predominantly as a consequence of government investment and technology. It's much cheaper now to provide a electronically driven, computerized respiratory testing equipment, basically what we all know as a peak flow meter. It's much easier to provide that now in rural communities and in smaller hospitals than it ever was 10 or 15 years ago. And that has also facilitated the proper diagnosis of diseases like COPD and asthma. So a lot of good things are happening in the healthcare system. So why, as an overall thesis, have phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, which are the pivotal trials for therapeutic advance, and why has that not been growing in China as it has been in some other Asian countries? So you can boil it down in some ways to a simple focus on protocol compliance. Because at the end of the day, when you run a clinical trial, what you really need to know is that the good clinical practice has been performed by the clinical trial sites, and that the integrity of the data and the correlation of the data with source documents, which means the patient's clinical record, that the correlation of the source document and the clinical trial data is as absolute as it can possibly be. That's the whole concept of good clinical practice, and it's the whole force behind the regulations that exist and the harmonization, the ICH harmonization of regulations around the world. When we look at a European waiting area, this is actually in Oxford. This is John Radcliffe II. It's the diabetes unit. I apologize for kind of putting it up there. This is their waiting area for their clinical trials, and you can see some of the patients, they might have to wait half an hour or an hour, but they can sit and they can read a magazine while they're waiting for their clinical trial visit. If we look at a hospital in Shanghai, actually in Beijing, this is a hospital in Beijing, it's a neurology hospital in Beijing. This is much more difficult. This environment is much more difficult for the patient to get through. I mean, actually getting to the right clinic is difficult because of the mass of people that are present in the hospitals. And once you're at the clinic, there are no, because space is at a premium, it's very difficult for a patient to wait. And if a patient knows that because they're in a clinical trial, that they have to go back for hospital visits more often than normal, there is a natural reluctance for that patient to want to go into the trial. So this is a more difficult environment for a patient, let alone, as we will see, for the staff that are actually running the clinic. When you look at the resourcing at sites, which is the second large problem, the pressure on physicians and clinical staff in Chinese hospitals is enormous. Some of the largest hospitals have 4,000 or 5,000 beds. They might have hospitals with 15 MRI machines, incredibly busy radiology departments, and the resource that's made available through clinical trial funding is, for administrative reasons, is not seen as investment that's available for each individual clinical trial clinic. It's actually income for the hospital. So very often the resource does not actually get to the clinic where the clinical trial is being run. So if you are and I have been, if you are a busy, hassled, first, second, or third year resident in a Chinese hospital, you would be reluctant to want to run a clinical trial because of the additional administrative burden that it puts upon you. The motivation of Chinese physicians and nursing staff is no different than the rest of the world. They are as humanly driven as they are in any other country, and there are wonderful things done. But the additional headroom to properly look after source documents is actually just not there. And a good analogy, a very simple message would be that if you're a specialist in the United States in a busy hospital, the chances are that you might see between 20 or 30, at most, patients a day. A similar specialist in a Chinese hospital, a busy Chinese hospital, is expected to see will have to see 70 or 80 patients a day to even keep up. And So that's another fundamental problem. The clinics are overloaded with clinical work. Now, what can you do about that? Well, there are systems in the world, and actually Japan is one of them, and it may be one of the reasons why Japanese data quality and Japanese trials are growing so fast, the pivotal trials are growing so fast. One thing you can do is provide clinical research coordinators through an SMO system where every single trial has to be supported. So every site in every trial must have, this would be one system. This is not currently the system in China. It is not regulated at the moment that this is the way. But if you want to make sure that your source documents are correlated with clinical trial data, then you, as a sponsor, you have to do something to make sure that there is enough resource to make that a practical reality. And from my point of view, I'm a clinical researcher. I'm not saying I'm not interested in the resources that dollars provide, but at the end of the day, my role is to provide high-quality data to my sponsors, and therefore I have to tell my sponsors, if you're not prepared to pay for that high-quality data in the face of inadequate local resources, then you basically shouldn't do the trial. It's not the right thing to do. It's not good clinical practice. And I do know that countries like Japan, where it is regulated, that clinical research coordinators and SMOs are required in every study, whilst it might be more expensive to run the trials in Japan, you do get very high quality data. And I think that's a good thing. At the end of the day, we don't want decisions being made about products and therapeutics and the way we look after people based upon cheap, low-quality data. That's many of our patients are vulnerable, and I don't think we are doing things in their best interests unless we are adequately investing in the way we run the trials, especially if you have a country that is in the face of such an enormous healthcare challenge. So you can see that in this example, where clinical research coordinators would be able to look after large databases of maybe 1,000 patients in an individual site, that's big, where they would be able to assist with study startup to accelerate the study, where they would be able to assist with essential document submission to make sure that the process of the study is being done properly, and where, very importantly, they would be able to ensure that the source documents, the patient's clinical record, are adequately reflecting what is in the clinical trial record. That is going to handle 100% of the sites. That is not an insignificant cost. $2.5 million on a study that might be a $15 million study is quite a significant increase in the cost. But as I'm saying, it is the price for ensuring, one of the prices for ensuring high quality data. The second issue is that are there smart ways that we can also help with ensuring protocol compliance? And one of the first things that you see happening in various ways in China is that making sure that the protocol is understood by the clinical trial sites, that it in some ways reflects the healthcare priorities and the local practice in terms of standard of care in China is not something that we always see. And a good way of knowing whether this is happening is whether or not the protocol is being reviewed by a steering committee which includes key opinion leaders in China. Now, we often see this happening in Japan, we often see it happening in the United States, but it is essential that it happens in China because the healthcare standard of care is different. And if a protocol doesn't reflect something that the clinical trial site staff understand, so if they don't appreciate why there is a particular activity in the protocol because it's a standard of care that might be done in the US, but it's not done in China, then you get less understanding by the clinical trial site, and I'm afraid you get a lower adherence to protocol, and you end up with more protocol violations. So it's very important very early on that the protocol itself is developed with key opinion leaders. And you know, with a global trial, we usually have steering committees which consist of experts from all the different countries. And I am just saying, when we do this, we must make sure that we include China. And finally, you know, assisting with the resources at sites, it's not just the provision of clinical research coordinators. It's also at a higher level through diplomacy from senior executives to help the hospitals actually shift the resources that are paid as a consequence of running the trial, rather than it becoming a running cost for the payment for the hospital, actually helping the hospital understand that investing in the clinical trial site is going to improve the quality of the research done in the hospital, and it's actually going to end up meaning that the hospital will attract more high-quality research in the future. At the moment, there is a disconnect from the fact that that money is paid to the hospital, and it doesn't actually appear very often in the clinical trial site within the hospital. There is definitely a rural issue in this very large, wonderful, beautiful country as well. Many of the patients with some of the most severe diseases are in rural communities, and they do not have access to urban hospitals. It is, from a pragmatic point of view, it is simply more difficult to run the trials in the western rural areas. And so there are probably 10 to 15 cities in China, in mainland China, which really are the best cities in which to run these clinical trials. And that sounds like a very pragmatic thing to say, but it's absolutely true. If your trial is not being run in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Wuhan, and possibly one or two of the other smaller main cities, it will be more difficult from a quality point of view for the trial to develop high-quality data. The resources become even scarcer when you move into rural communities. So if you were to summarize what the success factors are, addressing the clinical practice differences during protocol development is probably number one, and having a significant China element to the steering committee is very important. I'm not saying that's not important in other countries, but it's probably more important than in China than it is, say, between Australia and the United States. There is no question that from a site visit frequency point of view, increasing site visit frequency is also important, because once you have identified that there is a higher risk at a particular site because of lack of resource, perhaps, for source document verification, the only way to practically deal with it when you're in the middle of a trial is to increase the activity and the effort in making or helping make the quality of the data as high as possible. Constant education of the site staff. One of the challenges about this very mobile healthcare community in China is that there is turnover of staff almost continuously. And so you sometimes find that a practice nurse who was very well trained and extremely good at making sure that the quality of the data was high in a site, they disappear. And you've got to retrain the next person who is made responsible for the study. So turnover of staff is higher in general, and therefore it means that you've got to allow for a higher amount of training. And then finally, providing resource standardized resource, and we've already talked about that and how it has in fact very successfully worked in other countries like Japan in the past. And finally, I want to say something about technology that can help, and it is not at the moment used to any great degree in Chinese phase 2 and phase 3 global. I'm talking about global studies again that are being run in China. It's not used, but this is a new weapon in our armory for improving the quality of trials, which applies to every single clinical trial that's run in the world, but may especially apply to rapidly improving trial data quality in China. And first off, when you talk about risk-based monitoring, many people think that that means you can actually cut the costs of running a trial. Basically, by using technology, you identify which clinical sites are at risk, and the idea is that you might reduce the amount of monitoring. That's not the way to think about it. Actually, risk-based monitoring is likely to increase the cost of running the trial, but what it will undoubtedly do is improve the quality of data that is generated by the trial. And I'll take you through very quickly through the process of why that's the case. So again, another takeaway message: risk-based monitoring is not about reducing the direct cost. It may reduce the indirect cost because you could potentially not have to repeat the study, but it will not reduce the direct cost of running a study. So if you think about risk in a clinical trial, you can divide it into three things: dynamic risk, site risk, and then protocol risk. So dynamic risk is things like during the trial you might get an increase in turnover of staff, you might have site errors occurring, simple human error occurring in the site. You might have more queries than normal. That's something that could clog up the system. They could be real queries or queries that really maybe shouldn't have been asked, but all queries will end up creating more dynamic risk. Very rarely, I'm pleased to say, it could be misconduct or fraud, but this is much rarer. We all hear about it when it happens, but actually in my 20 years and over 1,000 phase 2 and phase 3 studies, this is something that I've had to deal with, but it's actually much rarer than most people think. The site experience is another risk. It's an infrastructure risk. So if a site has never done a trial before, or if the location of the trial is in a rural setting rather than in a teaching hospital, then obviously that's going to increase the infrastructure risk of that particular trial. And you can incidentally use this algorithm for an individual site within a trial. You can actually use it for an individual patient within a site within a trial as well. It's the whole model of risk-based monitoring. And then finally, there's the protocol itself, which tends to be the main thing that's always talked about when you set up a clinical trial. There's a lot of discussion about what the protocol issues are, whereas actually, and I'm not saying they're not important, they're very important, but actually the other causes of risk, the dynamic risk and the site risk, are actually often, in terms of implementing the trial, just as important as the protocol risk. But the protocol risk is going to focus around the therapeutic area, whether the patients are available, what vendors are being used to actually run the trial. And all of this can be worked into an algorithm which our programmers, our SAS programmers, can build into questions which are asked of the database as the database is filling up with data as the trial is being run. And the SAS programmers that do this they've variously been called internal CRAs. They are sometimes called data management associates, but the concept of risk-based monitoring is that you have a centralized team that is constantly looking at the data using algorithms based upon those 3 risk areas to identify patients and sites where things are not going exactly right. But it is a centralized data review that is constant, continuous. The role of such a site management associate is to look for those risk elements that apply functionally to regulatory issues, site performance issues. Okay, the one that everyone remembers is enrollment, but successful clinical trial is made up of many, many more things than simply enrollment. And then the data itself. Historically, we've mostly looked at risk in trials in relation to enrollment, and later on in the trial in relation to data queries. But this centralized risk-based monitoring does not just focus on those 2 traditional things. It's looking at data that is continuously going into the database in all of these elements. And for those of you that are into what data looks like when it gets analyzed in this way, this is actually an output from a real risk-based monitoring trial. For those of you that have ever done SAS programming, it actually looks a little bit like a SAS programming output. And the reason why the individuals need to be focused on this all the time is this is quite complex. You know, understanding from this output whether there is a risk with an individual site is not something that you can give to someone who doesn't understand, you know, how to set up a SAS program and how to actually make sure that the thing you're looking for is part of the risk-based monitoring profile. So that's the reason why this is not cheaper than running a traditional 100% monitoring program. This is complex. So in summary, you know, what I hope I've done is talked about aspects of running clinical trials in developed countries in Asia, like China, without being too pointed and with also being as diplomatic as possible. But at the end of the day, arguably, China is already the largest healthcare market in the world. You know, any one day there are more X-rays, more blood tests, more doctor consultations happening in China than anywhere else in the world. And so it is a huge opportunity for us to make sure that we're developing products, therapeutics, and medical devices for that very large market. As I said earlier on, I am an eternal optimist. I couldn't be an entrepreneurial CEO if I wasn't an eternal optimist. Of the 1,000 studies that I've done, I can tell you that only a handful have ended up with major products. So as everybody knows, most clinical trials fail. Global systems and processes are improving in China. There is absolutely no question. And I do sometimes hear people who are not involved in the healthcare system in China being rather negative about that country, and my feeling is that's unwarranted. Investigator and site staff sophistication in the clinical trial sites is also increasing and improving. No question, there's inadequate resource, but that's not because of lack of will. That's simply because the healthcare challenges in China are the largest in the world. The technical and therapeutic expertise is definitely improving. I would actually even argue that the CFDA probably, it does receive more submissions, more applications than any other agency in the world. And whilst most of those applications are genuine, there are some which challenge the CFDA because they're for products which probably China actually doesn't need. And so there's again, over the last 20 years, no question that China has become far more sophisticated and adept at handling regulatory submissions. I think you'll also find as well, as with all things, that the speed of approval of a clinical trial application, a CTA, in China will improve. Because politically, that has become something very important, and the fact that we have this decline in phase 2 and phase 3 trials in China is not something that the Chinese government obviously want to see in the future. So I think we will find that the regulatory hurdles will become lower than they currently are. And finally, a lot of effort, a lot of resource has been put already into developing a phase 2, phase 3 global clinical trial market in China. A lot of experience has been built. And the very fact that simply by providing adequate resource to ensure source documents are verified in the right way, that alone is likely to reverse many of the challenges that we've seen in the past. I'm trying to help get us back online on time, so I am actually going to stop there, and I would be very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.